Hi all, welcome to this paper, Northamptonshire's Caribbean Poltergeists, Evidence and Speculations, based on the final chapter of my PhD thesis. This was presented as part of, I guess, a two-day meeting or symposium organised by a group called Whose Knowledge, whose main goal is to centre the voices of marginalised communities on the internet. My research combines creative non-fiction storytelling with oral history testimony and limited engagement with archives to tell a history of Caribbean Northamptonshire in the absence of a black archive as well. The term poltergeist then means a mischievous ghost thought to be the cause of a mysterious noise such as rappings, and I use it not out of malicious intent, and I would not talk ill of the dead, but really to give a language to how Black history in Northamptonshire is always rapping on the door of the present. My PhD is in creative writing, not history or sociology, and it's almost entirely written on eyewitness accounts. It's about Black lives in Northamptonshire post 1942, largely focused on the Caribbean contingent as a rural history project. As a rural history project to expand our focus beyond the major cities. I start in the 1940s with not only what elders were doing in the rural Caribbean before they arrived in Northamptonshire, but also the first Black community in my area, which was the African American GIs. What I do know is on coming to Northampton in the 50s and 60s, many people I talked to and their families, including my own family, were recolonized away from their independent food pathways by British immigration policy as well. Between April 2023 and January 2024, I conducted nearly 130 interviews. I think it was exactly 130. I just did a recount with people and families who were in Northamptonshire, I guess between 1942 and 1990. In listening to those stories, it was only after I finished I saw these as stories from the graveside, which was a term that was suggested to me by my friend Sandra Simpson. I know she's not the first person to come up with that term, but she is where I heard it from, so I'm gonna use her as a source. And use her as a source. Um, first off, the inspiration the inspiration came from my late Auntie Louisa, who died in 2017. She was the family storyteller, and I learned about my great grandparents, who others like her. Oral history raises ghosts. The way history is taught as something that's boxed up, um, as something where the past, the present, and the future are in distinct spaces, um, is really backward to me. So my PhD is also one of phantoms, telling stories of places that in ways bring images of poltergeists in buildings, demolished by state racism, or spaces now taken over by other communities. Stories of Caribbean cricket, blues parties, community activism, black nurses, and so on are ghost stories, as well as because there's no paper trail, there's little paper trail. As folks reminisced, I saw how feelings of conflict intimately linked to local Northamptonshire buildings and the streets as well. In 1955, French Marxist and philosopher Guy Debord popularized the term psychogeography to describe how space and place influence collective psychology. In Northamptonshire, buildings and the streets themselves impacted how people remember. Even in interviews, emotions came to be tied to space. So across my 30 years, there were people reminiscing of past places, and that conjures up spectres, spirit, that stood at, that stands on the knife edge of public memory. Local photographer James Smith's project, Absent Status, documented locations of loss and mourning across Northamptonshire, like the barren land that once housed the Rastafarian Youth Centre, known as the Matafan Cantor Youth Movement, which was at this old Salvation Army citadel on Sheep Street. Psychogeography is an understanding that we are embedded or part of a consciousness and associations into the landscape. So researching my area, in March 2024, I also had the opportunity to go back to my grandparents' village and great grandparents' village on the Caribbean island of Grenada that they left in the early 1960s. My grandfather is one of 11 from a family of 8 sisters and 2 brothers. Uh, so going back to that village raised more spirits. My auntie Rosie, who came to Northampton in 1960, is buried there. I saw her spirit in the village. Stories can raise the dead. Losing 5 storytellers since the beginning of this project, elders carry energy. You learn to live with the spirits, and that, I guess, what I began to think of as apparition genealogy. It is never just one story, as one story takes tangents and into others, inheriting generations of ghost stories. The ways locals saw those stories was to keep them alive and celebrate them loudly, very opposite to, I guess, white Western forms of mourning, as something that's inherently sad, and where people try to forget as well. Caribbean forms of remembrance are very expressive. In Grenada, my family held a church service celebrating our ancestors, and my family danced a procession down through the village road and into church. Movement as a language, like a spiritual coding mapped within African dancing bodies, further described by Lantoinette Steins as ancestral data and Carolyn Cooper as noises in the blood. Grandroy is consecrated ground, and in going back, I got a sense of how stories can bring up the ghosts, the bodies, the past, sometimes literally, and thus we are at a close-up of a haunting. Finishing my thesis, I saw that while it will be read by the living, it also honours the dead. Grenada was also a time of telling stories, where there were speeches by elders telling the family history going back nearly 100 years. Traditions of preservation are being lost in our communities, assimilating into the West. These memories live in my grandmother and now me, so I'm haunted by the spirits, both the stories of of people that I interviewed, but also my own family history too. So over 100 interviews and their ancestors, these stories from the graveside are micro affirmations that go all the way back to Africa. When my grandparents were growing up in the countryside in the Caribbean, nobody had any electricity, and they would tell stories, especially during hurricane season when things got bad. We're on Earth surrounded by ancestors, but in the West, we rarely pay attention to this fact. As is something that I think Alice Walker said. So, source code to the universe. Classical historians will tell you investigation must be verified with data, parish records, marriage certificates, archival sources like that. But what about when you are not in the when your history is not in the archives? Oral history illuminates this power of belief that is borderline spiritual. In the words of Arthur C. Clarke, a white science fiction writer, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. My PhD has been an adventure through space-time as much as a journey into spirit. ITV's Empire's Child by journalist Charlene White is like me, chasing ghosts. Similarly, legal scholar Patricia Williams found her 2 times great grandmother was enslaved by a Tennessee lawyer named Austin Miller. These are stories of absences, ghosts, flying close to home, showing up with my own name, showing up in UCL's slave trade compensation records. In these names, I look for my ancestors, the shape of them. Caribbean Northants was a project where I found the shape of Northamptonshire, but specifically Caribbean Northamptonshire, in its absence. So if the ghost is a device for how we remember, ghost stories may reject how the university sees history as only the study of the observable past. My thesis is not a horror, but the ghosts surround it. but ghosts around it and black histories that go bump in the dark. And as always, if you thought this was interesting, leave comments, or if you've got questions, also leave a comment in the description, or you can send me an email at treyventour.com/contact.